Shalom from Jerusalem. This is our latest edition of Editor's Note. I'm Jonathan Hassan, and we are, of course, during the month of July, a broadcast break of sorts, since we still air twice a week the Israel at War updates, and once a week the deep dive featuring Hudson Institute, which I highly recommend. We just had yesterday, on Tuesday, other recording together with Dr. Michael Duran from Hudson Institute, as well as with Mrs. Rebecca Heinrichs, who was very insightful, as well as, of course, Major General Gilshon Cohen. An elaborate discussion, much nuances that were voiced in this conversation about the complexities that Israel currently faces, the U.S. faces, Western civilization at large. So if you have missed the last edition of Deep Dive, I encourage you to visit our website or our social media broadcasts, or a long list of new channels that are now also carrying our productions around the globe, including in Africa, including in North America. And very soon we will also announce a couple of additional channels. I will list the various channels in a future broadcast once we have everything set up. But diving into our current discussion, I'd like to welcome my dear friend, Professor Russell Berman, the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at Hoover Institution, where he's also a distinguished fellow.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Formerly, of course, Russell, you served as a senior advisor during the Trump administration.
Correct.
At the foreign planning staff.
The first Trump administration.
The first Trump administration, which was a very positive administration for the Middle East. We thought that peace and prosperity was the agenda of that day. Unfortunately, this is not the case at this moment in time.
Well, it was the agenda, and it will be again.
Inshallah, God willing, we say here in the Middle East. But let's dive into a couple of issues that I think that I get frustrated at times, I confess, with the lack of understanding and lack of knowledge of what truly is happening right now in the Middle East. Realpolitik, experts or self-proclaimed experts, and publicly ordained experts are seemingly flooded in social media, on television channels, even reputable channels and papers, with people who procured their education in one way or another, have managed to steer foreign policy with narratives and, unfortunately, ideologies that are impacting so much of the world that we're seeing today, rather than realpolitik.
This is true. I can be as frustrated as you about the lack of understanding of the broad region, but let your heart not be troubled. Things will be better. If we look at the press, if we look at the public discussion, really in the past months, of course, there's been so much focus on Israel and Gaza, and understandably so. But and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But let's not forget the character of conditions in the wider region. Syria continues to be a human rights catastrophe of enormous proportion. The misery in Sudan is part of this picture. Egypt is not Sudan, but it's surely not in an admirable state of affairs. The lack of democratic rights in Turkey, despite the election, lack of liberal democratic rights, the limits on journalism, something that you should, of course, be concerned about, and then the elephant in the room, the life in the in the Iranian regime, for women, but for everyone, is terrible. So the region as a whole has lots of problems. There has been focus on Israel and the Palestinians since October 7th, and understandably and perhaps rightly so. But it's not as if the rest of the region is in good shape.
Meanwhile, the Islamic Republic of Iran is racing towards nuclear weapon capabilities. Just a couple of days ago, there were also sanctions slapped by the current administration in Washington against the Ayatollah regime over matters of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, particularly focused, on the chemical weapons that it's engaged in. Not something many people talk about these days, of course. But within that context, do you see the engagement, the foreign policy of the Biden administration making things worse than they already are? Or are we currently in a trying to keep things as much as possible within a certain status quo, even though the literal translation of status quo, antebellum, is the way things were before the war? We're still in the midst of the war, so it's not necessarily that way, but where are we within your prism?
Well, that particular step, putting some sanctions on the Iranian regime because of its move toward weapons of mass destruction, that's a positive.
Right.
But it comes very late in the game. We're at the end of this administration's term. The election is just months ahead. One can't expect any significantly large policy initiative to develop between now and November or January, when the new administration would begin, whether it's a continuation of the Biden administration or a new Trump administration. So yes, one positive step, but the Biden administration has just made the whole situation a whole lot worse during the past 3.5 years. The Trump administration ended with the maximum pressure campaign in place. That is a significant wall of sanctions around the Iranian regime. The Biden administration has consistently dismantled that wall one way or another, either by rolling back the sanctions or by refusing to enforce them. What that has meant in practice is providing the Iranian regime with an enormous amount of revenue, which it has used in order to support its proxy forces around the region, Hamas, Hezbollah in particular, but not only the Houthis, the militia in Iraq. The root cause of 90% of the troubles in the region is the malign activity of the regime in Tehran, which works through proxies in order to maintain a barely plausible deniability. And the Biden regime has effectively supported them in extending their claws across the region.
Before the program began, we had a splendid conversation, very insightful of your part. I was more the recipient in this situation, I believe. But you touched on the reason behind the so-called appeasement policy that the Biden administration has towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, which started in the Obama administration. Can you maybe expand on that to kind of provide our viewers and listeners a better understanding of the reason for that foreign policy? And maybe I will then dive into the Iranian perspective towards the United States, towards Israel, where it actually comes from a fundamentally religious, strategic policy comprehension of how the things evolve from the Ayatollah regime, of course, throughout the region and beyond.
Sure. Of course, we can't forget the strong personnel continuity between the Obama team and the Biden team. Of course, Biden was part of the Obama team, and his advisors were part of the Obama team. So it's not surprising that they keep pursuing the same ideas, even though they've failed over these 12 years. The question really is why the core of the Democratic Party of the United States, as represented by the policy inclinations of Obama and Biden, wants to build bridges to the regime in Iran, the regime in Iran that has consistently announced its own inclination in the phrase not difficult to understand, death to America. This seems to be what they've been saying ever since 1979, and maybe people in Washington should believe them. Nonetheless, the Democrats don't want to weaken the lingering ties to Iran. What do they like about the Islamic Republic of Iran? I think there are a number of dimensions to this. I think first, the Obama administration in particular was focused on the threat of Sunni terrorism.
Al-Qaeda, Daesh.
And post 9/11, this is not implausible.
Right.
And they therefore were inclined to ally with the inner Islamic opponents of Sunni terrorism, hence a kind of unholy alliance with the Islamic Republic.
Which is very interesting that you say this, because I was researching for some work that I'm working on with regard to the Iraqi front, and I spoke with a couple of senior advisors there in Iraq, and some of them also affiliated with CENTCOM, and they said that during those days when they were fighting Daesh, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, that they were coordinating behind the scenes alignment of operational interests between Hashd al-Shabi, which is an alliance of 67 militias, roughly 46 of which are Iranian proxies or surrogates. There are different degrees of their affiliation there, to combat, of course, the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. So there was an alignment of interest there. And of course, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies at that perspective, so long as there are permanent interests that align within that context.
Yeah, okay, so that's the first part of the answer. Part of the American leadership traumatized maybe by 9/11, therefore looking for any opponent of Sunni terrorism, even if that opponent happened to be in Tehran. So a second dimension to the answer to your question, and this has to do with why the Democratic Party, maybe more broadly, is inclined toward Iran, and in a way that the Republican Party is not. I understand this as a direct reflection of the difference between a leftish focus on popular revolution and alternatively a Republican inclination toward conservative reform. Democratic Party, and of course there's a wide range in the Democratic Party, although less wide than in the past, often prepared to embrace revolutions overseas because they're seen as progressive.
Right.
Now, to treat the culture of the Iranian regime as progressive is gross and grotesque and wrong. Nonetheless, the Democratic Party manages to embrace that. In contrast to the Republicans, who are more comfortable with a conservative monarchy undergoing moderate reform process, as in Saudi. Iran, revolutionary, conservative. Saudi maps onto Democrats and Republicans, more or less, with exceptions in both groups. That's another part of the answer as to why the Obama and now Biden team is unwilling to push too hard against Iran and Iran's proxies. I read the Biden administration's efforts on a couple of occasions to limit Israeli incursions into Gaza as including a reluctance to see a complete decimation of Iranian assets, aka Hamas. That is, a part of American policy involved protecting Hamas because it was an Iranian proxy.
Interesting.
There's a third aspect to this, and this is sort of even worse, and that is that I believe there's a network of Iranian or pro-Iranian moles at work in the defense and the Defense Department and the State Department. And this has been reported in the press.
It's
I'm not
proven.
telling you any news here.
Robert Malley, or Rob Malley, who was the special U.S. envoy for Iran, still under investigation by the GSS. Ultimately, the State Department has relayed also much of that information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation to deepen its investigation, but with direct ties and not being responsible with classified information and relaying that to Iranian assets in the United States.
Yeah. So these kind of activists in positions of authority within the government really make this look like Cold War stuff. That is, once upon a time there were communists in the State Department. Now we get the Iranian moles.
Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, just recently asserted that Iran is actively engaged in altering U.S. Foreign policy. Not only foreign policy, but it's also actively engaged in U.S. campuses in support of Hamas, in support of the so-called axis of resistance, which it leads. Nevertheless, I still don't see a robust response from universities in a manner that befits those kind of allegations by a member of an intelligence institution in the United States, which should be listened to.
Yeah. So I watched a lot of this at Stanford, and I've written on the problem of the universities. I think there were pre-existing problems in higher education in the United States, the student debt level, the erosion of tenure processes, et cetera. But what October 7th and the aftermath made clear is that the model of the university, or especially the elite university for interesting reasons, is very shaky right now. And in many ways, these institutions have become national security threats. So I'm agreeing here. They've become national security threats in a number of different ways. They've become sites of potential espionage, but they've also been sites for the development of a de facto fifth column within the United States. The United States right now is blessed with partners who want to fight on their own. They just want U.S. support. I'm thinking of Ukraine and Israel. Neither is asking for U.S. soldiers.
Right.
But you could imagine a situation where the United States had to become involved directly in some kind of overseas operation. You can expect the campuses to become sites of disruptive opposition with highways blocked, access to airports blocked. This is just we just saw a dress rehearsal for that since October 7th. An interesting question is to tease out how much of this is Iran-driven, how much of this is China-driven, how much of it is Russia-driven. But at the end of the day, you don't have to choose. There's a national security threat bubbling, and the Biden administration is blind to it.
Well, I think that Iran, China, for sure, as well as the Russian Federation, are currently aligned for strategic interests. I do not think, as opposed to many people, that Russia wants to see Iran have a nuclear weapon, because the vast strategic implications to its own interests in the Southern Caucasus particularly would be devastating to Russia itself, and therefore there are different nuances that everybody should notice.
Yeah. So I agree with you that it is not in Russia's interest for Iran to have a nuclear bomb. But like everybody else, Russia may have to put up with it.
Right.
More importantly, I agree that there's a stronger than loose cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and I throw North Korea into that mix as well.
Yeah.
And their agenda is to weaken the West and to drive the United States basically out of Eurasia. They cooperate with each other even if their interests aren't fully aligned with each other. A smart Western foreign policy would pursue driving cleavages among those four different partners, because they really are differently positioned and with different interests. But I just do not see a sufficient intelligence, frankly, not in the sense of espionage intelligence, but just IQ in the diplomatic leadership in the West to figure that out.
Well, if I may just briefly explain to our viewers, with regard to the Islamic Republic of Iran, where does its hatred for Israel derive from? Since many of you know that Shiaism does not necessarily regard Jerusalem as holy, as lands of Waqf, as is defined by Sunni Muslims, but rather particularly the Iranians, or actually a little bit more than 80% of the Shiites worldwide, with chief focus on Iran, on Iraq, on Bahrain, on Lebanon. The majority of them are Twelvers. Twelver Shiite Islam focuses on 12 imams that took over, supposedly, according to them, from their prophet or proclaimed prophet Muhammad, and those 12 or the first 11 imams died, yet the 12th imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, was hidden to a certain degree, and still roams the earth in different places around the world. And they believe that at a divine or divinely ordained date, this Muhammad al-Mahdi will make himself known, and that will be the moment when he will establish a seat in Jerusalem, from where he will rule all of the world, and will bolster and establish a global peace for eternity, according again to Twelver Shiite Islam, granting his followers the peace and equality that they aspire, and no more issues that they will have to contend with. This, of course, is their revolutionary belief, and therefore when they're talking about exporting the revolution, it has to do with that specifically. And beyond that, until he makes himself known, this Muhammad al-Mahdi, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Iran, or whoever assumes that role, is basically designated or defined as the individual who receives supernatural messages from al-Mahdi to relay to the people in order to expedite the unveiling of al-Mahdi for that designated time. In that process, of course, one of the key elements is ensuring that Jerusalem, the city where I'm talking to right now, as well as the surrounding areas, will be accommodating to his unveiling and his so-called assertion of power. And for that purpose, one of their key aspirations is to annihilate the state of Israel. Now, within that context, in order to make that a reality, their top priority for the Islamic Republic of Iran is the preservation of the Ayatollah regime, because without that regime, the supreme leader is basically sent in exile, as Khomeini was in France in the past, and so on and so forth. But in order to keep this short, the two main elements that the Ayatollah regime focuses on is how to ensure the preservation of the regime is to export or to deepen Iran's footprint amongst its neighbors, particularly in the Middle East, but also beyond that. And the second element is to diminish the power of the one government that can challenge the export of the revolution, because of its defense of the rules-based order which the United States stand for, and that is obviously the United States, American hegemonism, as they put it. And in order to do so, I think that President Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, he was right when he countered Iran's strategy by promoting an Abraham Accords, where he believed and still believes that in order to ensure and even bolster U.S. influence in the region, the state of Israel normalizing and integrating into this region coincides with that strategy.
Your discourse on the religious background is absolutely important. Religion operates as the revolutionary ideology, if you will, for the Islamic Republic. I think there are other elements as well. I believe that Iran's leadership was traumatized by the Iran-Iraq War and has therefore pursued a policy of pushing the sites of conflict away from the Iranian borders, hence the operation through the proxy forces. It sees itself threatened by the United States, but I think it also sees the United States as weakened, as does Moscow, as does Beijing. Here, sitting with you, Jonathan, or back home in the United States, I have a fundamental optimism, and I assume sooner or later the West and the United States are going to prevail. I suspect that in Tehran and in Moscow and Beijing, they say, well, look what happened at the Kabul airport. Can't we have that happen in Kyiv? Could we have that happen at Tel Aviv airport too? Can we really defeat the West? And I think that we in the West should not discount the possibility that our adversaries are really pursuing that goal. And unless we have a robust response to them, they may well win. That is, the happy end isn't guaranteed. The happy end is only going to be there if there's a robust Western response. And that's why I believe, I hope, that a new Trump administration will return to the clarity and realism that the first Trump administration displayed.
5 days into the Biden administration, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken came out and declared that the State Department will revocate Ansar Allah, which is the organization dominated by the Houthi tribe, from the foreign terrorist organization designation list, namely removing it from the terrorist blacklist. 17 days later, we had President Joe Biden coming out and announcing that he will no longer support Saudi Arabia in its Saudi-led coalition campaign against the Houthis in Yemen in support of the internationally recognized government of the president at the time, Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. We see the various stages that go through that administration since the beginning that brought about merely several months later, Hossein Salami, the commander of the IRGC, in November of 2021, he came out and declared that the United States, under the current administration, has already lost and has lost the capacity to support the Zionist regime, as he put it, because it pursued certain campaigns that do not align with reality in the Middle East. And he defined it as Iranian triumph, and that the fact that the United States has lost, they just don't realize it yet, as he put it, has really indicated the severity of the position that the United States has found itself in during the current administration, merely 1 year in. And we didn't even get to the disengagement from Afghanistan. We didn't get yet to so many other developments that occurred that brought about the war of aggression by Russia into Ukraine, the various challenges that we're seeing happening in Africa. I mean, a day before the October 7th, on October 6th, a friend of mine who happens to be a CNN reporter just published a report that the Biden administration was considering to acknowledge that the coup in Niger was indeed a coup. which everybody realized it's a coup. Everybody realized that Russia and Iran outmaneuvered the current administration in Niger, and basically China, Russia, Iran, and a number of other countries are currently in a race to conquer Africa at the expense of the United States, France, and other Western countries who had a lot of influence in the continent. And we're seeing what's happening in the Pacific. Now, the world is at a state of disarray. And in order to bring some sense into this, the US must establish some friction, I would say, in order to basically bring to the forefront its strong power tool, which it is so ardently trying to avoid in every conflict that we're seeing throughout this region. And only then will its adversaries think twice, as happened in 2003 when the invasion of Iraq ultimately brought about the termination or at least suspension of the Ahmad project, namely Iran's nuclear files, indicate that it suspended its nuclear project to avoid the retribution of the United States because it had all the assets and tools available to it in order to establish an executive order that would have brought about the wrath of the United States on Iran. Can we see some sort of equation that would once again put those adversaries in their place within a potentially next Trump administration? Or would that be so alarming or at a stage where friction would, as the Biden team believes, spiral into an all-out conflagration globally?
Let's distinguish between two levels. One is we have to see the reality of the competition for power in the world. The Biden administration does not want to talk about that. The Biden administration instead seems to want to hide the emerging conflicts under general principles about human rights, humanitarian aid, which is why they rolled back the Houthi sanctions. Recognize the reality of the conflict. Second point is the insufficiency of the Biden administration's policies, point by point across the region, on taking the Houthis off the list, but now, in fact, recognizing that they have to do battle with the Houthis in order to preserve freedom of navigation. You mentioned Saudi as well. At one point, pariah state, and now efforts to embrace it. Just a bad mark on carrying out foreign policy across these 3.5 years. Those are two different issues. The reality of the conflict, the insufficiency, the poor quality of the foreign policy the United States has delivered. What the United States has to present is, you use the term friction, I would say deterrence, to demonstrate that it and the West in general has strength, and adversaries should expect to face that strength if they cross red lines. The Biden administration has been timorous about the possibility of any escalation, but that's a recipe for surrender. That's appeasement as a path to surrender. There has to be a way in order to mount a strong opposition to aggressive opponents that will stop them in their tracks.
Professor Berman, Russell, we wanted also to speak a little bit about the Qasem Soleimani strategy, the way it's built, and the focus, the historic perspectives to it, but also the implementation of this and how the modus operandi basically has brought us to the point of October 7th and the subsequent period. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So we'll have to keep it for a next edition of Editor's Note. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Pleasure to talk with you as well, Jonathan. Until next time.
Indeed. I'd like also to thank all of you at home as well. I'd like to, or at least I hope, that it was an enriching, informative program. We touched on a lot of topics. So until our next edition, I will do my best to bring Russell back to the studio to discuss elaborately on a couple of other issues that I really wanted to focus on beyond, of course, the Iranian grand strategy and how it employs it with different pressure points, and how potentially policymakers should follow up on this and see how they can also counter Iran's threatening posture towards not only the Middle East, but also Europe, as well as the United States proper, Australia for that matter. There are plenty of developments taking place. We're keeping a close eye on it all. But from here in Jerusalem, until our next program, including, of course, Israel at War tomorrow, hosted by Amir Oren. Until then, shalom.